The smell hit you before the building ever came into view. Peppermint. Spearmint. Thick in the air, so strong you could almost taste it. That's how 3,800 workers knew they were home each morning at the Wrigley factory on Chicago's South Side. At its peak, that single factory controlled 40% of America's gum market. 50 million sticks a day. Running 24 hours. 3 shifts. 363 days a year. The largest chewing gum facility on earth. Grandparents, parents, children, 3 generations working the same production lines, breathing that same sweet air. And then Wrigley made a calculation. 4 cents. That's how much cheaper it was to make gum in Mexico instead of Chicago. 4 cents per pack. In October 2005, the machines went silent. 3,800 jobs disappeared. The building that had sweetened America for a century sat empty. Neighborhoods that depended on those paychecks began to collapse. The gum still tasted the same. The company made billions. The workers scattered like dust. This is the story of how Chicago lost its signature flavor, and what happens when a spreadsheet decides that 4 cents matters more than 100 years of loyalty. William Wrigley Jr. was born in Philadelphia on September 30, 1861, into a family that made soap. Not fancy soap. Not artisanal soap. Industrial soap, the kind used to scrub factories and hospitals clean. His father, William Wrigley Sr., ran a small but steady operation. The family was comfortable, but far from wealthy. Young William grew up breathing live fumes and learning the unglamorous reality of selling commodities to customers who didn't care about your brand, only your price. The defining moment of his childhood came at age 11. He ran away from home. Not because of abuse. Not because of poverty. He was simply bored, restless, convinced Philadelphia had nothing left to offer him. He made it as far as New York before his money ran out, forcing him to return home, humiliated, to his father's soap factory. But that impulse stayed with him. The belief that somewhere else held something better. The conviction that standing still was the same as falling behind. That idea would shape every major decision he made for the rest of his life. His formal education ended at 13. He was a terrible student, impatient with books, allergic to rules. So his father put him to work stirring soap in the factory basement. Within a year, he was promoted to salesman. And he was good at it. Better than good. He had a natural instinct for reading people. He knew exactly what they wanted to hear and how to make them feel as if buying soap had been their idea all along. By the time he was 20, he was the company's top salesman, bringing in enough orders to keep the factory running at full capacity. But Philadelphia still felt small. In 1891, at 29, William convinced his father to let him open a sales office in Chicago. The city was exploding, doubling in population every decade. Factories stretched along the river and rail lines. Money flowed through the stockyards and grain elevators. It was raw. Ambitious. Unfinished. Everything Philadelphia wasn't. William borrowed $32 from his father, bought a train ticket, and arrived in Chicago with a suitcase full of soap samples and absolute certainty that he was going to make it big. What he found was a city that didn't need another soap salesman. Chicago had soap. Plenty of it. The market was saturated. Buyers were loyal to established brands. And nobody cared that William Wrigley Jr. had traveled all the way from Philadelphia with his samples and ambition. For 6 months, he barely made enough to pay rent. Here's the thing about Wrigley, his greatest strength and his fatal flaw were the same trait. He refused to accept that the market didn't want what he was selling. So he started giving things away. First, umbrellas with every case of soap. Then cookbooks. In late 1891, he tried something new, 2 packages of baking powder with every case of soap. The baking powder sold better than the soap. That was the moment the real story began, even if no one realized it yet. By 1892, William Wrigley Jr. had stopped selling soap entirely and shifted to baking powder. It wasn't revolutionary. Baking powder was baking powder. But Wrigley had learned something critical: the product mattered far less than the incentive attached to it. So he offered premiums again: kitchen tools, dishes, small household goods. And with each package of baking powder, he included something else: 2 packages of chewing gum. Chewing gum in 1892 wasn't new. It had existed in various forms for decades. Thomas Adams had pioneered chicle-based gum in the 1870s. Several companies produced it. But it was still seen as a novelty, something children bought with pennies, not a serious product for adults. The market was small. Fragmented. No one had figured out how to turn it into a major business. But Wrigley noticed something. Customers weren't asking for more baking powder. They were asking for more gum. In January 1893, he made the pivot. He stopped selling baking powder and committed entirely to chewing gum. At that moment, his total capital was $780, barely enough to cover his first shipment of chicle from Mexico and rent a small manufacturing space on Chicago's west side. He had no factory of his own. No production expertise. No reputation in the gum industry. What he did have was instinct, the feeling that the market was about to open wide, and the willingness to bet everything on that instinct. He launched two brands at the same time, Lotte Gum and Vassar. Both failed immediately. The gum was mediocre. The packaging forgettable. There was no reason for anyone to choose Wrigley's gum over Adams or any of the other established brands. By the summer of 1893, he was nearly bankrupt again. What saved him was the same thing that had gotten him into the gum business in the first place, his gift for promotion. He couldn't compete on product quality, not yet. So he decided to compete on visibility. He started spending money he didn't even have on advertising. Newspaper ads. Streetcar placards. Painted signs stretched across brick buildings. He sent free samples to practically every address in Chicago neighborhoods, tens of thousands of small packets of gum mailed directly to people's homes. Most companies in his position would have pulled back. They would have conserved cash. Tried to grow slowly. Carefully. Not Wrigley. In October 1893, he launched Juicy Fruit. Weeks later, he introduced Spearmint. This time, the formulas were different. The flavor was better. The sweetness lasted longer. The packaging actually stood out on store shelves. But even more important than the product itself was the strategy behind it. Wrigley made both brands impossible to ignore. He plastered Chicago with advertisements. He gave gum away by the case to merchants who agreed to display it prominently. He hired young women to stand outside department stores and hand out free samples to passers-by. By the end of 1893, you couldn't walk through downtown Chicago without seeing Wrigley's name, or tasting his gum. And the numbers told a story no one could argue with. In 1893, Wrigley sold $13,000 worth of chewing gum. By 1895, that number had jumped to $300,000. By 1898, it had passed $1 million. Juicy Fruit and Spearmint weren't just selling. They were becoming the default. When people said gum, they increasingly meant Wrigley's gum. In 1899, he formally incorporated the business and opened his first dedicated manufacturing facility in Chicago at 3535 South Ashland Avenue. By later standards, it was modest, just 50,000 square feet, but it was his. Production capacity, 5 million sticks of gum per day. Employees, 127. The factory ran 2 shifts, 15 hours a day. Within a year, it was running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, and still couldn't keep up with demand. By 1910, William Wrigley Jr. controlled 25% of the American chewing gum market. And his ambitions had grown right alongside his success. The Ashland Avenue facility had been expanded 5 times, but it still wasn't enough. So Wrigley made a decision that would define the next century of the company. He wouldn't just build a factory. He would build a monument to American manufacturing. The new Wrigley complex broke ground in 1911 on a massive tract of land on Chicago's south side. It was designed to be the most advanced chewing gum production facility in the world. The main building alone covered 13 acres of floor space, more than 12 football fields under one roof. Eventually, the complex stretched across 24 acres in total, with separate buildings for chicle processing, gum-based production, packaging, and shipping. The architecture was deliberately grand. Brick and limestone. Massive windows to flood the interior with natural light. Soaring ceilings in the production halls. This wasn't just a place where gum was made. This was where an empire announced itself. The scale was staggering. By 1915, the factory employed 1,800 workers and produced 18 million sticks of gum per day. By 1920, employment had doubled to 3,600, and daily production had climbed to 30 million sticks. To put that in perspective, that was more chewing gum than the entire population of New York City could consume in a week. While competitors were still working out of cramped, inefficient facilities, Wrigley had built a vertically integrated manufacturing powerhouse that controlled every step of production. Chicle arrived by rail directly from plantations in Mexico and Central America. Wrigley had even bought stakes in several chicle operations to guarantee supply. The raw material was processed on site, turned into gum base, mixed with sugar and flavorings in massive rotating drums, extruded into sheets, cut into sticks, wrapped by machines Wrigley himself had helped design, packed into boxes, and shipped to distributors across North America. The factory had its own power plant, its own water treatment system, its own fire brigade. It was essentially a small city with a single purpose: producing chewing gum at a scale no one had ever attempted before. What's remarkable about this era is that Wrigley understood something many manufacturers of his time did not. Brand and production capacity were inseparable. He couldn't advertise his way to dominance if he couldn't meet the demand that advertising created. And he couldn't justify massive production capacity without the revenue that came from brand dominance. So he expanded both at the same time. He poured money into advertising while expanding the factory, each investment feeding the other. By 1925, Wrigley controlled 40% of the American chewing gum market. The Ashland Avenue complex was the largest chewing gum factory in the world. And Chicago had become synonymous with chewing gum. When people thought of gum, they thought of Wrigley. And when they thought of Wrigley, they thought of Chicago. But the factory became something else, too. It became the center of gravity for the surrounding neighborhoods, back of the yards, Brighton Park, Pilsen. These communities swelled with workers who came for steady paychecks and the promise of upward mobility. Wrigley paid above-average manufacturing wages. He offered health benefits that were rare for the time. He built a reputation as a fair and decent employer. Families planned their lives around shift schedules. The smell of mint became the smell of stability. A tradition that began in the 1920s lasted until the factory closed. Every worker was allowed, even encouraged, to chew gum during their shift. All 3,600 employees at any given time sampling the very product they were making. The company believed that workers who loved the product would make a better product. Whether or not that was scientifically true, it created something powerful: culture. The Wrigley factory wasn't just a workplace. It was a source of pride. Most companies would have stopped there. Not Wrigley. William Wrigley Jr. spent more on advertising than any other chewing gum manufacturer in history, and possibly more than any manufacturer in any industry relative to revenue. By 1920, he was spending $3 million a year on advertising, the equivalent of roughly $45 million today. That represented more than 15% of total company revenue, a ratio that would make modern CFOs faint. But it worked. Wrigley's advertising strategy was unlike anything else in American business at the time. He didn't just buy space in newspapers and magazines. He bought every visible surface in American cities: streetcar placards, billboard walls, painted brick facades, electric signs. Huge. Bright. Impossible to ignore. When neon technology emerged in the 1920s, Wrigley was one of the first major advertisers to deploy it at scale. The most famous example was the Wrigley Building in downtown Chicago, completed in 1924. It wasn't the manufacturing headquarters that remained on Ashland Avenue, but it was a statement to the world. Its white terracotta facade was illuminated by floodlights at night, making it glow like a beacon visible from miles away. It was the first building in Chicago to be permanently illuminated, and the effect was mesmerizing. The building itself became an advertisement. Not for a specific product, but for the idea of Wrigley, as an institution. As something permanent. As essential as a bank or a cathedral. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Wrigley didn't just advertise to consumers. He advertised to retailers. He didn't stop at consumers. He sent free product to small stores and newsstands all across America. Along with the gum came display racks, posters, promotional signage, everything a shop owner would need to show it off. He offered volume discounts so generous that it almost made no sense not to stock Wrigley's brands. Retailers weren't just customers anymore. They were extensions of his marketing machine. By the late 1920s, Wrigley gum was available in more than 1 million retail locations across the United States and Canada, more points of sale than Coca-Cola. Another stroke of genius was repetition. Wrigley understood something simple but powerful: people didn't need to be convinced that chewing gum was good. They just needed to be reminded, constantly, that Wrigley's gum existed. Reminded so often that reaching for a pack of Spearmint became as automatic as tying your shoes. So the ads were simple. Repetitive. Relentless. The flavor lasts. Chew it after every meal. The same phrases. The same imagery. Year after year. Until they blended into the cultural wallpaper. By 1930, Wrigley had become the most recognized chewing gum brand in the world. The company expanded internationally, factories in Canada, England, Australia. But Chicago remained the heart. The flagship. The standard every other facility tried to match. And then came the Great Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, American industrial production fell nearly 50%. Unemployment hit 25%. Disposable income vanished. Luxury purchases became unimaginable for many families. Chewing gum should have been one of the first things people gave up. It was pure discretionary spending. A nickel for something you chewed and threw away. No nutrition. No practical use. Just pleasure. Wrigley made a decision that, at the time, seemed almost insane. He doubled his advertising budget. While competitors were cutting costs, reducing staff, and trying to survive quietly, Wrigley poured even more money into visibility. His reasoning was simple, and completely counterintuitive. In a depression, people have less money. That means every purchase matters more. If Wrigley disappeared from public view, customers would forget the brand existed. But if he stayed visible, stayed present, then when someone did have a nickel to spare, they would remember Wrigley. It worked. Between 1929 and 1933, while most manufacturers watched their sales collapse, Wrigley's revenue dropped only 12%. The company never missed a quarterly dividend payment. The Ashland Avenue factory never laid off workers. Instead, hours were reduced so the available work could be shared among as many employees as possible. In neighborhoods where unemployment climbed above 50%, the Wrigley factory became a lifeline. Think about that. In the worst economic crisis in American history, a company selling chewing gum, something nobody truly needed, not only survived but remained profitable by spending more on advertising. The pattern would repeat decades later. Brands that pulled back during recessions often lost ground permanently. By 1935, as the economy slowly recovered, Wrigley's market share had actually grown. The company now controlled 42% of U.S. chewing gum sales. Competitors who had retreated were left scrambling. Wrigley had won by refusing to blink. William Wrigley Jr. died in 1932 at age 70, one of the wealthiest men in America. His son, Philip K. Wrigley, took over and continued the same philosophy: relentless advertising, tight vertical integration, and an unwavering commitment to Chicago manufacturing. In 1936, the factory expanded again. New production lines were added. Capacity rose to 50 million sticks per day. Then World War II changed everything, though not in the way anyone expected. When the United States entered the war in 1941, sugar and other key ingredients were strictly rationed. Wrigley faced a difficult choice: cut production and quietly manage reduced inventory, or find another way to remain relevant. Philip K. Wrigley made a move that defied basic business logic. He pulled juicy fruit and spearmint off the civilian market entirely. The full production capacity of the Ashland Avenue factory was redirected to supplying gum for U.S. military personnel. Every stick produced during the war went into soldiers' rations. For 4 years, the company essentially surrendered its civilian revenue stream. But Wrigley understood something profound. Soldiers chewing gum in Europe and the Pacific were the most powerful advertisement imaginable. When those men came home, they would remember the gum that had been with them in foxholes, aboard ships, and in bombers flying over Germany. During the war, Wrigley produced more than 1 billion sticks of gum for the military. Every American service member knew the brand. When civilian production resumed in 1946, the demand was explosive. Post-war America was a consumer paradise. The economy boomed. Wages rose. And an entire generation of veterans associated Wrigley gum with comfort, routine, and home. Sales skyrocketed. By 1950, the Ashland Avenue complex employed 4,200 workers and produced 70 million sticks per day. The factory expanded again, a new packaging facility in 1952, modernization of the chicle processing operation in 1955. By the late 1950s, the complex covered 32 acres and included 7 major buildings connected by covered walkways and underground tunnels. It wasn't just a factory anymore. It was a city within a city, complete with its own cafeteria, medical clinic, credit union, and recreational facilities. This was the golden age. In 1965, Wrigley's market share peaked at 45%. The company had successfully beaten back competitors like American Chicle and Beechnut. Innovation continued steadily: new flavors, new packaging styles, new marketing campaigns. Wrigley became one of the earliest major sponsors of network television programming, bringing the brand into American living rooms night after night. But beneath the surface of all that success, something was quietly shifting. The economics of American manufacturing were beginning to change in ways that would one day threaten the viability of the Ashland Avenue factory. At the time, no one at Wrigley saw it coming. Why would they? Every metric suggested continued dominance. But the 1970s brought the first warning signs. Labor costs in Chicago began rising faster than productivity improvements could offset. The factory still ran near full capacity. It was still profitable. But margins were tightening. Unions negotiated higher wages and better benefits, good for workers, unquestionably, but it made manufacturing in Chicago more expensive compared to other regions. The numbers still worked. For now. But the math was beginning to change. At the same time, international competition was rising. Companies in Europe and Asia were launching their own chewing gum brands, often with lower production costs and fresh, innovative products that appealed to younger consumers. Wrigley was still dominant in North America, but its global market share was beginning to slip. The company's response was modernization. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, Wrigley invested millions into upgrading the Ashland Avenue facility. New machinery, automated packaging lines, computerized quality control systems. The goal was simple: make the factory so efficient that higher labor costs wouldn't matter. It helped. But it didn't fix the deeper issue. Geography was slowly turning into a disadvantage. Chicago was far from Wrigley's fastest-growing markets, which were increasingly in the South and West. Shipping costs were rising. And the North American Free Trade Agreement was beginning to reshape the economics of manufacturing across the continent. What's striking about this period is how slowly the crisis unfolded. There wasn't a dramatic collapse. No single moment when everything fell apart. Instead, it was erosion. A few percentage points of market share lost here. A few basis points of margin squeezed there. The factory was still profitable. Employment was still above 3,000. But the trajectory had shifted. And no one wanted to admit it. In 1992, William Wrigley Jr. II, the founder's grandson, became CEO. He inherited a company that still looked enormously successful by most traditional measures. The brand was powerful. The advertising machine still worked. The factory remained productive. But beneath it all, the math was beginning to look ominous. In the early 2000s, Wrigley's leadership commissioned a series of detailed analyses comparing the Chicago facility's cost structure to potential alternatives. The findings were blunt. Labor costs in Chicago were roughly 3 times higher than in northern Mexico. Energy costs were higher. Transportation to major markets was more expensive. Real estate taxes. Regulatory compliance. Environmental requirements. Every single line item favored Mexico. Operating the Chicago factory cost about 10 cents per pack. A new facility in Monterrey, Mexico, could operate at roughly 7 cents per pack. That 4-cent difference, multiplied across billions of packs each year, added up to hundreds of millions of dollars. And here's the hard truth about that calculation: it was completely accurate. And completely incomplete. It measured the cost of production. It did not measure the cost of abandoning a century-old relationship with a community. It didn't account for the institutional knowledge carried by a workforce where multiple generations had worked side by side. It didn't reflect the brand value of being Chicago-based. And it certainly didn't capture what would happen to the social fabric of neighborhoods when 3,800 jobs disappeared overnight. But publicly traded companies don't optimize for social fabric. They optimize for shareholder returns. And shareholders wanted that 4 cents. In 2003, Wrigley announced plans to build a new manufacturing facility in Monterrey, Mexico. Publicly, the company framed it as expansion, additional capacity to support growth. But anyone who understood manufacturing economics knew the truth. You don't invest $1 billion in a state-of-the-art plant to supplement a century-old facility. You build it to replace it. The Monterrey plant opened in 2004. It was modern from end to end, fully automated, built around 21st century logistics, engineered for efficiency in ways the aging Ashland Avenue complex simply could not match. Its production capacity, 80 million sticks of gum per day. More than Chicago had ever produced at its peak. In October 2005, Wrigley made it official. Chewing gum production at the Ashland Avenue facility would cease. Some administrative operations would remain. The building would temporarily serve as a warehouse and distribution center. But the manufacturing, the beating heart of the complex, was over. The final production shift ran on October 28, 2005. Workers who had spent 30, 40, even 50 years on those lines walked out for the last time. They carried severance packages. They carried memories. But what they were losing couldn't be replaced. Within 18 months, employment dropped from 3,800 to fewer than 600. By 2010, that number had fallen to 200. By 2016, even the warehousing operation was shut down. The building sat empty. The closure devastated surrounding neighborhoods in ways that went far beyond the headline number of 3,800 lost jobs. Yes, those direct positions disappeared. But those jobs supported entire economic ecosystems. The diners and lunch counters where workers ate. The bars where they gathered after shifts. The local shops where paychecks were spent. The suppliers delivering raw materials. The contractors maintaining the machinery. One study estimated that every Wrigley job supported an additional 2-3 jobs in the local economy. That means the closure likely eliminated more than 11,000 jobs across Chicago's South Side. And these weren't easily replaceable positions. They were middle-class manufacturing jobs, with benefits, pensions, and stability. The kind of jobs that built the American middle class in the first place. The neighborhoods never fully recovered. Back of the yards, already struggling, saw its poverty rate climb above 40%. Brighton Park lost population as families moved away in search of work. Pilsen fared somewhat better, but the factory's closure removed a stabilizing economic anchor that had supported the area for generations. The building itself became a symbol. 13 acres of empty industrial space. Dark windows. Cracked parking lots overtaken by weeds. Developers occasionally proposed turning it into condominiums or mixed-use retail space. But the numbers never worked. The complex was too large. Too specialized. Too expensive to retrofit. In 2015, the city of Chicago designated the Wrigley complex as a landmark. That at least protected it from demolition. But preservation isn't the same as revival. It simply meant the empty building would remain, officially recognized as historically significant, but still vacant. Meanwhile, in Monterey, production continued at full capacity. Output surpassed what Chicago had ever achieved. Costs were precisely as projected. The gum tasted the same. Consumers didn't care where it was made. They cared that it was affordable, available, and familiar. From a purely financial perspective, the move worked. Profit margins improved. Shareholders were satisfied. In 2008, Wrigley was acquired by Mars Incorporated in a $23 billion deal, at the time the largest all-cash transaction in corporate history. The Mars Wrigley operation continued to thrive. On paper, everything made sense. But what no spreadsheet could capture was the cost of breaking a contract that had never been written down. For more than a century, Wrigley and Chicago operated on an understanding. The company would provide stable jobs and serve as an anchor for the community. The city, in return, would provide workers, infrastructure, and an identity rooted in industry and pride. It was never written down. It didn't need to be. It was simply how things worked. When Wrigley left, it exposed a painful truth. The contract had always been an illusion. No amount of loyalty. No decades of service. No multi-generational commitment could compete with a spreadsheet that pointed somewhere else. The message to Chicago's workers was brutally clear: you are not irreplaceable. Your experience does not outweigh a 4-cent cost advantage. Your community is not a variable in global supply chain optimization. That's why the Wrigley story still matters. Not because of one company. Not because of gum. But because it shows what happens when economic logic collides with social obligation. Wrigley's leaders didn't make an immoral decision. They made a rational one within the framework of modern capitalism. And that's exactly what makes it so unsettling. Lesson 1. Geographic advantage is never permanent. For decades, Chicago's location was a gift. It sat at the center of North American markets, connected by rail and road to every major city, backed by a deep labor pool and a powerful industrial infrastructure. That advantage vanished when manufacturing costs began to outweigh logistics. Mexico offered cheaper labor, lower energy prices, and access to the same markets through modern highways and rail. Some competitors adapted differently. Companies like Hershey stayed in the United States by heavily investing in automation, shrinking the labor component so geography mattered less. Others diversified production across multiple sites so no single facility carried the full burden of rising costs. Wrigley kept everything concentrated in one place for a century. And when that place became too expensive, there was nowhere else to turn. The universal lesson: location-based competitive advantages decay. If your strategy depends entirely on being in the right place, you become vulnerable the moment the definition of right changes. Lesson 2. Institutional knowledge has no line item on a balance sheet. At the Chicago factory, there were workers whose grandparents had stood at the same machines. They knew how equipment sounded when something was off. They could smell a problem before it showed up on a monitor. That knowledge was real. It had value. But it didn't appear anywhere in the cost comparison with Monterey. Modern accounting doesn't measure institutional wisdom, cultural continuity, or community integration. So when executives run the numbers, those elements are assigned a value of 0. The new plant in Mexico could hire workers who had never made gum before. Train them in weeks. Produce output that was indistinguishable from Chicago's. The uncomfortable truth is this: in highly automated, standardized manufacturing, institutional knowledge matters less than we like to believe. Modern production systems are designed specifically to minimize dependence on individual expertise. The romantic idea that experienced workers are irreplaceable runs headfirst into a system engineered to replace them. Lesson 3: Brand identity and production location can be separated. Wrigley was Chicago. The gleaming Wrigley building downtown. The Ashland Avenue factory. The sponsorship of the Cubs. The identity was tightly woven. Executives worried that moving production to Mexico would damage that bond. It didn't. Consumers kept buying gum at the same rate. The brand remained strong. The product was identical. The price stayed competitive. Most customers never cared where it was made. The hard lesson: what companies believe defines their identity often matters only to them, not to buyers. Other companies understood this earlier. Nike, Apple, Dell. They moved production offshore without waiting for financial pressure to force their hand. They recognized that brand value lives in marketing, design, and quality control, not in the physical location of a factory. The takeaway is blunt: sentimentality is not a business strategy. Markets punish companies that maintain expensive operations for symbolic reasons while competitors optimize for cost. Lesson 4: The social contract is not enforceable. This is the most uncomfortable lesson of all. For 100 years, Wrigley and Chicago had a mutually beneficial relationship. The company gained labor and infrastructure. Workers gained stability and middle-class lives. Generations planned their futures around the assumption that the factory would always be there. When the math shifted, the relationship ended. No history. No loyalty. No integration into the community could override a cost-benefit analysis pointing to Mexico. The company had the legal right to leave. From a fiduciary standpoint, it arguably had the obligation to do so. But legal rights and social obligations are not the same thing. What Wrigley's closure revealed is that in modern capitalism, social obligations are subordinate to shareholder returns. The implicit promises that sustained working-class communities for generations, that loyalty would be reciprocated, that companies were stakeholders in the places they operated, turned out to be unenforceable. The bitter truth: companies are not loyal to places. They are loyal to cost structures, market access, and return on capital. When those variables shift, they move. Communities that build their futures around a single major employer are building on sand. Today, if you drive down Ashland Avenue on Chicago's South Side, the Wrigley complex is still there. The massive brick buildings remain, protected by landmark status. But they are empty. The windows are dark. The loading docks are silent. The mint-scented air that once drifted through the neighborhood is gone. The Wrigley building downtown still glows at night, still part of the skyline. But it's mostly leased to other companies now. The gum is still produced, billions of sticks every year, but it comes from Monterey, from Poland, from China, from wherever the economics make sense. The work is scattered. Some found other manufacturing jobs, though those grew scarce on the South Side. Some retrained for service work. Some retired early with partial pensions. Many left Chicago entirely, chasing employment wherever it appeared, a familiar American story. The neighborhoods never found a replacement anchor. Back of the yards. Brighton Park. Pilsen. They continue, but they carry the weight of an economy that moved forward without them. Diners closed. Union halls emptied. The rhythm of shift work that structured daily life for a century simply stopped. What lingers about this story isn't that Wrigley made the wrong choice. By the standards governing modern corporations, it may have been the only rational one. What lingers is the realization that we have built an economic system where the rational decision and the humane decision often stand in direct opposition. And when that conflict appears, economics wins. Chicago didn't just lose a factory. It lost a covenant that had endured for 4 generations, the belief that if you showed up, worked hard, and made a good product, the company would stand with you as you had stood with it. That covenant dissolved not just in Chicago, but across thousands of American communities. That is the deepest story of late-stage industrial capitalism. The gum still tastes the same. The brand survives. Shareholders prospered. But something essential was lost on Ashland Avenue. Something that cannot be reduced to cost per unit or captured on a balance sheet. It was the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself. The certainty that your work mattered not only to profits but to a place and a people. The confidence that the building where your grandfather clocked in would still be standing for your grandchildren. That sweetness turned bitter. And Chicago will taste it for generations.